I'm 80 years old now, and I want to share something with you today that took me 8 decades to fully understand. The less I explain myself, the happier I become. That sentence sounds simple, almost too simple, but I promise you, the wisdom hiding inside it took an entire lifetime to arrive. Welcome, my friends, to Eternal Flame Wisdom. Today's conversation is one of the most personal I have recorded, because it touches something so many of us carry quietly for decades without ever naming it directly. The exhausting, invisible habit of explaining ourselves, our choices, our feelings, our decisions, our very existence. Today, I want to tell you why I finally stopped, and what happened to my happiness once I did. Let me take you back to where this habit began, because understanding its roots helped me finally release it. The first thing I had to recognize was how deeply the habit of explaining myself had been trained into me from childhood. Like so many of you, I was raised in a generation where children were expected to justify nearly everything. Why did you do that? Why did you say that? Explain yourself. These phrases echoed through my childhood so often that by the time I reached adulthood, explaining myself had become an automatic reflex, almost a nervous tick of the soul. I explained my career choices to relatives who questioned them. I explained my parenting decisions to in-laws who disagreed with them. I explained my financial choices, my friendships, my hobbies, even my moods, to anyone who raised an eyebrow in my direction. For most of my adult life, I did not even recognize this as a burden. It simply felt like basic politeness, like the responsible thing a good person does when questioned. I did not realize how much of my daily energy was being spent defending decisions that were, quite honestly, nobody's business but my own. The second thing I discovered was the true exhaustion hidden inside constant self-justification. It was not until my 70s that I began to notice how tired this habit made me. Every explanation, even a small one, requires a kind of internal defense. You must gather your reasons. You must anticipate objections. You must present your case as though standing quietly on trial in front of a jury that never actually asked to judge you in the first place. I remember a conversation with my sister, when I was around 74, in which I mentioned that my wife and I had decided to sell our large family home and move into a smaller, simpler apartment. Immediately, I felt the old reflex activate. I began explaining. The maintenance had become too much. The stairs were difficult on my knees. We didn't need the extra bedrooms anymore. On and on I went, defending a decision that, in truth, required no defense at all. It was our home, our choice, our life. My sister, to her credit, simply said, "You don't need to explain it to me. I trust you know what's best for yourselves." That sentence stopped me completely. I realized, in that moment, that I had spent the better part of 80 years defending decisions that people had rarely even truly questioned. I had been putting myself on trial voluntarily, again and again, for an audience that mostly just wanted to hear the decision, not interrogate it. The third thing I learned was that most explanations are not actually requested. We offer them preemptively, out of old fear. This was perhaps the most surprising realization of all. Once I began paying closer attention, I noticed that the majority of my explanations were entirely unprompted. Nobody had asked me to justify why I chose not to attend a particular family gathering. Nobody had demanded to know why I preferred spending my afternoons gardening instead of joining a social club. I was volunteering these justifications before anyone even raised the question, driven by an old, deeply rooted fear of being perceived as selfish, difficult, or wrong. Once I saw this pattern clearly, I began experimenting with something new. I began simply making decisions and stating them plainly, without the automatic paragraph of justification that used to follow. We've decided to skip the reunion this year. Full stop. No explanation about the long drive, the crowded schedule, or the tension with certain relatives. Just the decision, stated simply and confidently. The results surprised me. Almost nobody pushed back. Almost nobody demanded further explanation. The elaborate defenses I had spent decades constructing had mostly been unnecessary all along, built for objections that, in reality, rarely came. The fourth thing I understood was that explaining myself excessively had, without my realizing it, been quietly undermining my own authority over my own life. Every time I offered a lengthy justification for a simple personal decision, I was subtly communicating, even to myself, that my choice required outside approval to be valid. Over decades, this habit slowly eroded my confidence in my own judgment. I began seeking validation before I even acted, running potential decisions past friends and family, not because I genuinely wanted their input, but because I had become dependent on their approval to feel secure in my own choices. At 80, I finally recognized this pattern for what it was, a slow erosion of my own inner authority, built one small unnecessary explanation at a time. Now, when I make a decision, I simply make it. I do not need my children's approval to decide how I spend my afternoons. I do not need my neighbor's understanding to decide how I maintain my garden. I do not need old friends' agreement to decide which relationships I choose to nurture and which ones I choose to let quietly fade. These are my decisions, made with 80 years of accumulated wisdom behind them, and they do not require a defense to be legitimate. The fifth thing that changed everything was learning to distinguish between sharing and explaining. I want to be careful here, because I am not suggesting we should become closed off, cold, or unwilling to communicate with the people we love. There is a profound difference between sharing your life openly with people who care about you and explaining yourself defensively to people who have questioned or challenged you. Sharing comes from generosity. I tell my daughter about my day because I want to include her in my life, not because I need her approval of how I spent it. Explaining comes from fear. It is offered defensively, preemptively, anxiously, to head off criticism before it arrives. Once I learned to recognize this distinction, my relationships actually became warmer, not colder. I still share freely with the people I love. I tell them about my days, my thoughts, my joys, and struggles. But I no longer package that sharing with an invisible legal defense, anticipating and preemptively countering objections that were never actually raised. The sixth thing I discovered, and perhaps the most liberating of all, was that the people who truly love you rarely need explanations, and the people who demand them rarely deserve that much of your energy. This lesson took the longest to fully accept, because it required an honest look at certain relationships in my life. I had to admit that some people in my life had, over the years, developed a habit of demanding justification for my choices, not out of genuine care, but out of a subtle need to maintain control or influence over my decisions. Once I stopped offering elaborate explanations to these particular individuals, some relationships grew distant. I will not pretend that didn't happen, or that it was entirely painless. But here is what I learned from that distance. The relationships that faded were, in truth, built more on my compliance and justification than on genuine mutual respect. The relationships that remained, and even deepened, were the ones where my simple, unexplained decisions were met with trust rather than interrogation. Those are the relationships worth protecting at 80 years old. Those are the people who deserve my remaining time and energy. I think often now about how much of my life I spent as a defendant, quietly standing trial for decisions that never required a verdict from anyone but myself. The tragedy is not that I explain myself. Explanation, in appropriate contexts, is simply honest communication. The tragedy is how much of it was unnecessary, offered out of old fear rather than genuine need, consuming decades of energy that could have gone towards simply living. These days, at 80, my life feels remarkably lighter. When someone questions a decision I've made, I no longer feel the old compulsive need to defend it extensively. Sometimes I offer a brief, honest reason. More often, I simply say, "That's what I've decided," and allow the conversation to move forward without an elaborate justification trailing behind it. I want to speak directly to those of you watching today who still feel that old compulsion, the need to justify your choices to adult children, extended family, old friends, or even strangers who have opinions about how you should be living your remaining years. I want you to know, with the full weight of 80 years behind these words, you do not owe anyone an extensive explanation for your own life. You are allowed to make decisions and simply state them. You are allowed to change your mind without justifying the change. You are allowed to say no without providing a paragraph of reasoning. You are allowed to live the remaining years of your life according to your own judgment, built on decades of hard-won wisdom, without needing outside approval to validate your choices. This shift, the less I explain myself, the happier I become, has become one of the truest lessons of my later years. It did not happen quickly. It required decades of old patterns to slowly unwind. But I promise you, on the other side of that unwinding is a peace unlike anything I experienced during all those earlier decades of constant justification. If you take one thing from today's conversation, let it be this. Your life does not require a defense. Your choices, made with the wisdom of the years you have lived, are legitimate simply because you made them. You are allowed to simply live now, quietly, confidently, without narrating every decision to an audience that, in truth, was rarely paying as close attention as your fear once told you they were. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today at Eternal Flame Wisdom. If this message reached something inside you, please share in the comments below what you might finally be ready to stop explaining. Take care of yourselves this week, my friends. Make your decisions quietly. Trust your own judgment. And release the exhausting habit of justifying a life that has already proven itself worthy simply by being lived this long, this fully, and this honestly. Until next time, this has been Eternal Flame Wisdom. I will see you in the next conversation.